shall value add our resource for our economy and unlocking maximum benefit from our country's abundant mineral resource. Government will therefore continue to support the drive by Kamativi Mining Company towards the processing of lithium ores into concentrates.
Africa is a major economic force in terms of the riches of its natural resources. Africa is home to 30% of the world's mineral reserves. In addition, it has 65% of the world's arable land, 40% of the world's gold, and up to 90% of its chromium and platinum. Unfortunately, African nations have found it difficult to efficiently utilize their abundant resource wealth due to a history of colonial dominance. Damaged political structures, carelessly defined state borders, and a trade strategy that relies on exporting resources to big corporations rather than exploiting the minerals for economic development are all legacy effects of colonialism. Given the complexity of Africa's issues, we will not attempt to cover them all in a 15-minute YouTube video. We might instead concentrate on the distinctive ways in which certain nations are attempting to correct the colonial-era trading paradigm. But we have to go back to see how. Depending on when this video is published, Emmerson Mnangagwa, the president of Zimbabwe, declared in December 2022 that his administration would outlaw the export of unprocessed lithium ore without prior written approval. It may seem like a humorous policy to limit exports. Why would a government purposefully block some industries from selling their goods to the global market? Export restrictions are really more prevalent than you may imagine. 34 nations restricted food and fertilizer exports between the start of 2022 and June of that year. The limitations were a reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, two nations that produced about 30% of the world's wheat. Significant exports of various crops, honey, corn, and fertilizers are also made by Russia and Ukraine. During the height of the COVID outbreak, export restrictions were also prevalent. A World Trade Organization report states that 85 nations have imposed export restrictions of some kind on a variety of medical items. Toilet paper exports were even restricted in 2 nations. However, export limitations aren't limited to stockpiling essential supplies. Additionally, they might be employed to support some industries at the detriment of others. This is one of the reasons Zimbabwe has banned the export of lithium. A prohibition on the export of raw lithium ore is intended to draw high-value manufacturing and processing facilities to Zimbabwe. The comparatively large pay earned by these plants' employees would subsequently be reinvested in the economy. However, export restrictions have drawbacks. Do you recall the dietary limits I stated before? The supply of goods traded on the international market was reduced by the limits imposed on the export of food and fertilizer. The price of food and fertilizer on international markets increased as a result of the reduction in supply. Global food prices rose by about 40% compared to the previous year in May, just a few months after Russia invaded Ukraine. This was the biggest increase in 10 years. Numerous international organizations, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, are warning of a food catastrophe since the situation is so dire. Analysts are concerned that Zimbabwe's prohibition on exporting unprocessed lithium ore would affect lithium prices globally in a similar way. For example, the cost of selling 1 metric ton of lithium carbonate to the US has gone up from about $5,000 in 2010 to $17,000 in 2021. Additionally, Zimbabwe has the largest lithium reservoir in Africa and one of the greatest lithium reserves worldwide, despite not being a major exporter of the metal. We'll respond to the following queries in this video. First, what is the significance of lithium? Second, how is the mining sector in Zimbabwe doing? Third, what is the likelihood that Zimbabwe's economy will gain from the export ban? Last but not least, should we be concerned that Zimbabwe's prohibition on the export of raw lithium may cause a distortion in the price of lithium globally? What makes lithium so crucial? Global lithium output averaged fewer than 35,000 metric tons between 2011 and 2016. Lithium production then averaged about 85,000 metric tons between 2017 and 2021. What causes this significant rise? A legally binding agreement to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels by 2050 was signed by 196 nations worldwide in 2015. Countries are required by the Paris Agreement to submit their plans for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, are the name given to these programs. Countries must reduce emissions in every area of their economies in order to reach their carbon reduction targets. Road traffic is responsible for 12% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, according to data gathered by Climate Watch and the World Resources Institute. That is the same as about 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere by trucks, buses, motorcycles, and cars. Any strategy to combat global warming that does not include electrifying the transportation sector is likely to be unsuccessful. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that 76% of the NDCs that were filed included some kind of mitigating strategy. Let's talk about electric cars. Even after taking into consideration the production of batteries and the electricity required for vehicle charging, fully electric cars have a lower carbon footprint than conventional gasoline-powered cars. Many nations have created laws to encourage people to buy electric cars instead of the more traditional gas-powered models. For example, Romania's Ministry of Environment offers a €4,500 subsidy for plug-in hybrid cars and a €10,000 incentive for fully electric cars. Additionally, these incentives are effective. Since 2010, sales of electric vehicles have grown annually, and by 2030, the International Energy Agency predicts that there will be more than 175 million electric vehicles sold worldwide. Automakers want a dependable power source in light of the rising demand for electric vehicles. Lithium is, coincidentally, the lightest metal in the periodic table. Its energy density is high as well. Lithium's appeal to automakers stems from these characteristics. Because they are lightweight, the vehicles they power require less energy to move. But they also have a high energy density, which allows them to hold a charge for extended periods of time. Lithium-ion batteries are popular among automakers since they are also less expensive than some alternatives. How is the mining sector doing in Zimbabwe right now? Zimbabwe is categorized as a lower middle-income nation by the World Bank. Its GDP per capita as of 2021 is just under $1,300 USD, which is less than the $1,600 USD earned by all of sub-Saharan Africa. The mining industry, which contributes around 12% of Zimbabwe's GDP, has been the country's economic bright spot. However, the difficulty is that smuggling is a widespread issue. The Ministry of Finance claims that illicit means cause Zimbabwe to lose minerals valued at about $2 billion. Lithium is also smuggled, but gold is the favorite of mineral traffickers. The low starting wages of those employed in those industries contribute to the high rate of mineral theft in Zimbabwe. In May and August of last year, the Zimbabwean Chamber of Mines and the Associated Mine Workers Union of Zimbabwe secured 2 pay increases for miners. The lowest paid miner's monthly wage would increase from $44.64 to $93.07 Zimbabwean dollars due to the first raise, which represented a hike of almost 100%. With the second raise, pay increased by almost 78%, meaning that the lowest paid miners would now make about $166 a month. These pay increases initially appeared to be more than generous. There wouldn't be a need for unions in the US or Australia if they were able to negotiate wage rises of more than 100%. The General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Diamond and Allied Minerals Workers Union, however, denounced the pay increase as double nonsense barely 2 days after the initial one. The Solidarity Mine Workers Union of Zimbabwe's General Secretary said that the country's miners were earning slave wages following the second pay increase. I should point out that Zimbabwe has a long history of high inflation before you assume that these unions are just avaricious gold diggers. Zimbabwe's inflation became so severe between 2008 and 2009 that the government ceased releasing statistics on it. However, according to analysts, Zimbabwe's monthly inflation rate reached at around 80 billion% by November 2008. The local money was essentially useless as a result. The government responded by substituting the US dollar for Zimbabwean currency. Prior to the introduction of a new currency in 2018, Zimbabwe's inflation was controlled by the US dollar's stability. Regretfully, the high inflationary episodes that Zimbabwe had experienced only a few years prior were rekindled with the introduction of the new currency. Zimbabwe's annual inflation rate hit around 600% in 2020. Furthermore, inflation in 2021 is still at almost 100%, even though it is significantly lower than it was the year before. The fact that Zimbabwe's inflation is growing worse rather than better doesn't help either. By the end of 2023, inflation is expected to reach 400%, essentially negating the pay increase that miners received the year before, according to analysts. However, poor salaries are not limited to Zimbabwe's youth. After accounting for purchasing power, 40% of Zimbabweans lived on less than $2.15 per day in 2019. Approximately 35% of people in sub-Saharan Africa lived on less than $2.15 per day, which is greater than the average for the region. Poor incomes result in poor investment and consumption levels. Additionally, it indicates that a government has a limited revenue base from which to expand its economy. This contributes to Zimbabwe's high rate of inflation. The government prints money to pay for its expenses because tax revenue is so low. The government of Zimbabwe seeks to recruit new processing plants because of these drawbacks. Because they demand different skill sets, employment in battery manufacture and mineral processing typically pay more than positions in mining. Greater household consumption would result from higher household incomes, increasing the amount of money that businesses get. To preserve their market share, the businesses would then reinvest this additional profit in hiring more personnel and purchasing better machinery. Increases in household income and business profits would also result in higher taxes paid to the government. As a result, the government has more money to invest in infrastructure projects like railroads, which allow businesses and people to make even more money. To put it briefly, increased household income generates a positive feedback loop that influences economic growth. Will Zimbabwe's economy gain from the lithium ban? There are two issues with depending on commodity exports to drive economic expansion. First, a nation that depends on exporting commodities will see the sharp fluctuations in commodity prices. The economy does well when commodity prices rise. The economy does not do well when commodities prices decline. This has frequently happened with nations that export oil. Consider Venezuela. Countries who supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War were subject to a 5-month oil embargo supported by OPEC in the middle of the 1970s. Venezuela became the richest nation in Latin America as a result of the increase in oil prices. However, when oil prices dropped 10 years later, Venezuela's economy collapsed. Additionally, the IMF was forced to save the nation at the end of the decade. The second problem with relying on commodity exports is that it limits a nation's ability to influence international commerce. The manufacturing sector accounted for the majority of trade in products between 2010 and 2020. The manufacturing sector contributed approximately $13.5 trillion to international trade, according to UN data. Less than half of that came from the combined contributions of the natural resources and agricultural sectors. How may these problems be resolved, then? By prohibiting the export of raw lithium ore. Any exports are a result of a nation producing more than is needed with its own population. As a result, they sell the excess to customers abroad. Although this is a very oversimplified take on international trade, it does help us understand why Zimbabwe has banned the export of lithium. A prohibition on exports would result in an excess of a good in the country if it exports because it produces more than is required domestically. Prices would then decline as a result of the excess supply. Since raw lithium ore exports are prohibited in Zimbabwe, there should be an excess of lithium, which will drive down the price of the metal domestically. This is good news for lithium processing facilities and battery manufacturing facilities that purchase lithium, but bad news for lithium mines that now have to sell their products at a discount. These businesses can now buy lithium at a reduced price and pass the savings forward to customers, increasing the competitiveness of their goods on the international market. The fact that Zimbabwe will be less dependent on resource exports, which make up a small portion of world trade, is another advantage, because businesses will need to offer a competitive wage to attract the skilled labor required to produce batteries or process raw lithium ore. Workers may also gain. Nevertheless, there are some significant limitations to export prohibitions. Initially, they are only effective if the nation enforcing the limitations has a substantial capacity for higher value procedures. And it appears like Zimbabwe is setting itself up for that. The government recently inked a deal to build a $3 billion battery metals processing facility with two Chinese companies, Pacific Gold Investment and Hong Kong Eagle International Investment Holdings. Additionally, Zimbabwe and Tangshan Holdings Group have inked a deal for the establishment of lithium mining and processing facilities within Zimbabwe. The second warning about export limitations is that the businesses that are most negatively impacted must nevertheless be able and ready to offer the product to the domestic market at a reduced price. Therefore, export-dependent businesses reduce production in reaction to declining profitability when they are prohibited from exporting their goods to the global market. Additionally, they might permanently close their doors if earnings change into losses. Normally, we would anticipate that the government would intervene to assist these very essential industries. However, any assistance will be difficult given Zimbabwe's history of hyperinflation. For example, OECD researchers discovered that Zimbabwe's export bans of raw chromium ore in 2007 and 2011 had little effect on the competitiveness of businesses that process the ore. However, because to large investments from Chinese companies, Zimbabwe now has a strong capacity to refine raw lithium ore into higher value goods, something it may have lacked in 2011. Zimbabwe may take the first step toward becoming a middle-income nation if its mining industry can provide these businesses with lithium ore at competitive pricing. Should we be concerned that the prohibition on lithium exports from Zimbabwe would cause a distortion in the price of lithium globally? Large lithium ore exporters would benefit from higher lithium prices, while everyone else would suffer. In addition to making electric vehicles more costly, automakers may decide to use less reliable batteries in order to save money, and a decline in quality might completely deter buyers from buying electric vehicles. However, Zimbabwe's prohibition on lithium exports probably won't cause prices to rise too much. With over 75% of the world's lithium production, Australia and Chile are currently the biggest producers. Indeed, Zimbabwe possesses the greatest lithium reserves in Africa and among the largest in the world. But these enormous quantities pale in comparison to those found in other regions of the world. Chile, Australia, Argentina, and China are the only 4 countries that contain more than 90% of the world's lithium reserves. If Zimbabwe's prohibition on lithium exports has any impact at all, it is probably going to be minimal. African nations have been given the short end of the stick in terms of economic growth for many decades. Africa still has a long way to go before it overcomes the burdens imposed upon it by its previous colonial oppressors, even though living standards have improved over time. Countries can use a variety of tools to facilitate this shift, including export bans. Although a complete prohibition is a blunt instrument, nations should also think about less stringent export restrictions. For example, tobacco, oils, and coffee are all subject to export levies in numerous African nations. Zimbabwe is making an effort to overcome the economic repercussions of colonialism by prohibiting the export of lithium. It remains to be seen if the nation will succeed in this endeavor. But one thing is for sure. Throughout the coming years, a lot of economists will be keeping a close eye on Zimbabwe. We appreciate you watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more informative videos like this one.